this is my stitch journal, which kind of started in 2013 as a kind of, I suppose, I wanted to stitch to see what would happen if I stitched every day. I was quite inspired by a piece of work by a Canadian textile artist called Judy Martin. He'd done a 3-year project called Not to Know But to Go On. And I kind of had a large quantity of recycled linen from some damaged curtains. So, and I suppose it's been something that, you know, over time has had different functions for me. It's a kind of moment in the day, although that moment is often at different times, where I kind of pause, and it offers me kind of a reflective space. You know, if I stitch for 10 minutes or if I stitch for, you know, far longer, to process some things probably to do with working life, sometimes to do with personal stuff. I tend to use threads that I dye myself, so it's got that kind of layer of connection for me as well. And I suppose as a way of kind of thinking through making, it offers sometimes a way of thinking about things differently. So yeah, it's a really interesting process, and I've used it as part of project research. I've used it as a way of reflecting on things that I hear when I'm working on long-term textile projects. Little bits of fabric sometimes wend their way into the kind of mix that are significant to particular bits of work I've been doing. So that's a bit of turkey red cotton from a project I was working on in Lancashire.
And show us your PhD marks.
Well, I've kind of recently submitted my PhD thesis with the Open University, which is a project connected to two long-term textile projects that I worked on, but this section is kind of my final edits, really. So I've been picking away at the text and rewriting and revisiting and editing out words or whole paragraphs, and so these little kind of woven spaces are like these little kind of ways of going into that text in new ways. And you can see lots of kind of really neon bright colours, a bit like, you know, your highlighter pen mark might be on a bit of paper. So it's that's me revising and revisiting lots of stuff that happened kind of quite a long way ago. So back here, where I was trying to kind of just do my research, and I was thinking through the participant interviews I did. They kind of all these little hexagons, they kind of joined up into you know, ways of approaching my thinking through my subject. Yeah, so my research has kind of wended its way through the cloth as well. So
there's a lot of memories there. Have you written it down at all, or is it all just in your head about?
So I have reflected on it in writing. I've written about it in both my books. I mean, in terms of sort of specific periods of my life, I could certainly go through and identify them. One of the things I like to do, actually, I kind of tend to leave long, I leave my threads, my long threads, until I can kind of maybe resolve my thinking about what's been going on. So I kind of then come back to it and I couch them down at a later date. So I've got all these kind of circles that appear across the cloth, which are a kind of, a way of maybe, resolving things. Could be a thorny bit of research or a work thing, or it could be, you know, something personal that's been put to bed.
So stitching with meaning, like, it's really impressive. And How did you start, or was that a childhood thing, or not necessarily on
Yeah,
this, but
no.
you know, where did all this come from?
I can't really remember learning how to sew, but I was kind of surrounded by people who made things. So I suppose my mother is a really good dressmaker, and she made all our clothes when we were little. There was always a sewing, mostly practical, sometimes decorative. She also embroiders and she knits, and so there was always a kind of something being produced for the house or for us kids. And so an early memory for me is her putting my twin brothers down for a nap and being out on the kind of dining room floor with all her pattern pieces and pretending they were islands and jumping. So about two or three, jumping from kind of piece to piece and getting into trouble. But and my grandmother, who came to live in the UK when I was about 10 or 11, she was also extremely skilled in kind of textile, pretty much anything. So I suppose being surrounded by that, it's almost like kind of osmosis. I can't really remember not doing it. So, yeah.
Do you find many people have that sort of immersion in it, or are you somewhat rare?
So in my teaching, I do a lot of kind of, I suppose, encouraging participants to really kind of think through textile experiences or textile objects in their lives, and maybe finding or a garment of significance and talking about that. And I do find, some people have that experience where they really grew up around kind of people who made stuff. They grew up in wandering around markets and kind of just being surrounded by bolts of cotton and stuff. I mean, but then some people not at all. So it's just a real mixture. Sometimes that's a generational thing. So I find that people who are older than me often have had that experience, less so in people my age and younger. But again, not always. Not always. So
Obviously, it's useful to have skills to apply, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's massively useful, and I think that it gives you agency over your own stuff, which can be a hugely powerful thing. I mean, I think sometimes life can be extremely messy and complicated, and I mean, you sometimes just having that kind of feeling that you've dealt with one little thing, and it might be replacing a button or fixing a hole in your tights, just managing running repairs on things to keep them kind of serviceable and things that you can kind of wear in your daily life can be a really it can make you feel like you've got some control over it in a world where there are so many things that you just literally can't repair. You deal with objects and kind of electrics that have planned obsolescence built in. You can't actually do anything about that, but you can maybe put your own hem back up again. So
and it's a bit sad that these skills are not readily available. Do you have a sense of how they could be shared more widely?
Well, I mean, my kind of work, a lot of my work is in community settings, and I mean, so one of the things that I feel really passionate about is the opportunity that people get to skill share together, and rather than having a kind of teacher kind of showing you and telling you everything, I think that when I look around the table at a community textile event, what I see is that the person next to you might be threading a needle for you because you've forgotten your reading glasses, or there might be a kind of particular stitch that somebody's doing, or a real classic is always the kind of European style and non-European style knitters, and in a city like this where we have a really, really diverse population from all over the world, you see all these kind of different ways of approaching stitch techniques and knitting techniques, and you watch as how around a table space these things can be kind of really kind of exchanged and shared, and the skill base of everybody improves. So I really like that kind of way of working where you've got a kind of collective sense rather than you being told this is how to do something. So yeah.
And what was your PhD about? That is, it's still emerging, but coming.
Yeah, well, so the projects that I looked at were, I'm interested really as somebody who's lived in this part of the UK for most of my life. The kind of experience of post-industrial textile communities is really important, and it's something that hasn't actually been given a massive amount of research. There's a lot of research into former mining communities, for example, less so about textile places. And so I was interested in whether looking at the heritage, specific heritage of Bradford here in West Yorkshire, which is a kind of wall city, and Accrington in East Lancashire, which is a place that had a kind of connected to the cotton industry, very much printing and dyeing, and how projects that looked at those original industries encouraged participants to kind of engage in slow craft based work could over time have an impact on the kind of resilience of participants and those places. So one of those projects was 5 years of work, a long-term community residency, and the other was done over kind of 2.5 years. So I'm really interested in the kind of the amount of time that is given to things, and how working in a particular place for a long period and really having a very kind of embedded approach to that activity, working with participants over a long period of time, seeing how sometimes that journey for them can involve skill learning and skill sharing that can be actually quite transformative in terms of their daily kind of daily lives, and what comes from that, and so what is left afterwards. So yeah, it's an ethnographic project, so I've written it from my perspective as a practitioner researcher, so it is my kind of working life that I'm also kind of examining there. And it was kind of rudely interrupted by the global pandemic, so there's also quite a lot of insight really into how somebody with nearly 20 years of kind of community-based practice involving face-to-face work with people, how does that change when you're kind of in isolation and you have to pivot into a world of online work? Because I have to say, that has really kind of stretched my kind of view of how I work. And I've just described working around a tabletop and those sorts of things, which is just impossible on a Zoom screen. But there are other ways of connecting and gathering that I think also kind of have informed my research project. So.
Oh, well, that's great. Sounds like there's more to come there. But could we talk now about your wardrobe? I notice on your cuffs you've got lovely stitching holding them together, and the neck as well. So you're hands-on with your own wardrobe as a result of your stitching.
Yeah, this is a shirt. This is a hand-me-down from my mum. So I kind of tend to. It's my lucky shirt. I wear it for. It's an old, probably 1990s Gap shirt. It's just kind of quite a just areas of wear rather than holes. So I've kind of done a little bit of reinforcing around, particularly the kind of extremities of it. And there's the odd stain that I've also described, kind of disguised with a bit of stitching. I tend to wear it for kind of talks and lectures and things like that. Quite like.
Oh well, I'm honoured to put it on today, and the jumper too looks gorgeous. It's thrifted.
Yeah, a charity shop find, a bit of a good find. I'm very pleased with this one. It's wool, and it's, I think, probably looking at it, it's a very skilled knitter. You can see I've had it about, I don't know, 10, maybe over 10 years. I think it's probably 1960s, looking at the kind of buttons and stuff. So yeah, I like to kind of use and reuse stuff. I've got kind of things in my wardrobe that I've had for a long, long time. One of my daughters is currently wears a top that belonged to my grandmother when she goes out clubbing, a kind of 1960s shell top. So we kind of we do like kind of passing things around the family, which is a nice way.
The circular wardrobe.
Well, indeed, apart from when they don't tell me they've borrowed stuff.
And maybe don't wash it after they've worn it too. Yeah. They've spilt something on it.
Yeah, reeking of smoke.
So what's your motivation for being involved in your wardrobe in that way? I mean, obviously meaning comes into it. Are there other things?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of really like that. I do like the storytelling potential of objects. So I think that one of the things about clothes and textiles in general is because of their kind of universality and the fact that we spend most of our time connected to them in some way. They're kind of ordinary objects, but they can be quite extraordinary as well. And so a lot of the work I do is in places that are quite underserved and have been for generations, really. And that kind of opportunity to tell a story about your life and to do it in a really kind of hands-on way, and to do it in a way that feels personal to you is quite a big ask, actually. I think it's quite hard to ask people questions like that. But if you do it through a garment or something that is really an everyday textile, it's a different way of communicating. So I think the communication potential of clothes is something that really kind of fascinates me. And in areas where textile-based kind of working and immigration and how the city has changed, and it does offer ways of having these stories about how people arrive, how they belong, what you know, and everyone has a different version of that story. But actually, you'd be amazed at how, you know, they kind of, the story of a cardigan can be it can be a story of migration. It can, you know, the materials it's made of can really inform a story about history, about global trade, about sustainable practices, about how we save things and what we choose to save. So there's just this kind of fabulous way of making connection.
So fast fashion obviously doesn't enable that, really, does it? Is this, can we talk about that, the sustainability aspects and I guess almost that loss of story through your clothes?
Well, I don't know about that. Because fast fashion is there's another type of story there. There's a huge amount of stories there about, you know, colonialised kind of trade, about things that shift to the other side of the world that are now out of sight and so are conveniently kind of ignored. There's another very tangled kind of way of thinking about that as a different sort of story, and I've been doing some recent reading around kind of synthetics and thinking about those in the context of climate action and about their prevalence in the kind of global kind of fashion industry. Thinking that you know, thinking about how you apply kind of storytelling to that stuff as well. And I just wonder whether encouraging people to tell stories about stuff is the way to really kind of engage, actually. I spent some time this week looking at videos from the 1960s of the polyester revolution, and women's lives, and how this kind of wonder fabric transformed their domestic, all of that. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, well, it's not going away at the moment, and certainly it's not going away out of landfill either. So there has to be better ways of thinking around it. That's not an answer to the question.
But you're right. I mean, there is a story to be told there. It's a different story, and in the context of changing climate, it's a bit of a problematic story that we're not being as resourceful with it. It's kind of a wasteful approach, do you feel? Can you address that?
Well, I mean, there's just a huge issue around consumption and expectation of what we are consuming or what we should be consuming. And I think, it's that story of excess. And I mean, I'm just looking around my studio here and I'm thinking about, the huge amount of kind of stash that people who make things and work with materials end up kind of accumulating. And, I mean, there's probably more thread in this room than I could ever work with in a lifetime, even if I spent all day stitching every day. It's kind of, it's not necessary for me to have that amount of stuff. And so, I have to kind of question it in my own life and my own practices, as well as looking at kind of these abstract notions of huge global industries. It has to start somewhere. So maybe it starts with me dispersing some of it.
And with your clothes, like, have you got a lot of clothes as well, or is your focus here more than in your wardrobe?
I don't have huge amounts of clothes, and actually I think if I did a wardrobe audit, if I did a serious audit, there are lots of things in there that I've literally probably not worn for years. But with 4 daughters, what I've seen now is that the kind of, there are things that I don't wear anymore that they now do. So I'm trying to kind of think about that as a nice circle, really, because I'm not a kind of fashionable person. I don't wear high fashion and never have really, but you can see how things become kind of popular, and they wax and wane, don't they? So the things that I do have, I'm quite happy to kind of I keep them going. So.
And how does that feel, the keeping going? Just the and the therapy involved with stitching and caring for things. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, I kind of like. I like the sensation of keeping something in use. So I like that. And yeah, I suppose it's an act of care. That's an interesting one. Yeah, because I mean, I think about, a lot of the community settings that I work in is absolutely as spaces of care, and the kind of work with textiles that happens in those spaces is care. It's full of care as well. It tries to be. Yeah, I'm not really great at applying this thinking to my own self, I have to say. I find that really hard. I'm working on it.
When you were speaking to me earlier off camera about your mother and grandmother's approach to stitching, you mentioned that it's part rebellion. Being able to do these things is sort of like a bit of a thumbing the nose at the consumption merchants.
Well, yeah, and also just like this kind of absolutely sort of resolute, I will do it myself. I don't need any of this stuff that goes on around it. I can, I look after it myself.
So that's a sense of agency and autonomy, is it?
It's
drives that.
Well, that, and it's also a sense of not having very much, not having access to things, not having the money for things, and so there's a very strong sense of kind of thrift in there as well.
But it's about not being wasteful too.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Do we need a bit more of that in the world now at the moment, of overconsumption and concern about climate?
Well, yes, absolutely. And I think adjusting kind of expectation around newness and kind of thinking about, the value of the kind of newly produced over things that we already have, and how you can kind of reframe the stuff that you already own. And the kind of huge interest in kind of mending and repair skills in textiles kind of very much comes into that. How you kind of apply value to your existing objects, and that comes back to care as well. So I suppose it's telling ourselves different stories about stuff.
Unfortunately, the commercial drivers are for continual growth and new flash things to buy, aren't they? So really, it requires cultural change for anything to be different.
Well, yeah, massively, and that's a difficult position to take if you are kind of engaged in the world in terms of things like social media or the media in general, because it perpetuates this kind of do this, try this, have this,
How can we create some change then, do you feel?
Well, I think my interest comes from something of a sort of heritage perspective, really, is how you kind of look at how previous generations have engaged with materials, and that could include clothing, telling a longer story. So, rather than this extremely kind of focused on the absolute now, look at the longer story of things, understand the longer story of things in your life. Think about if you're thinking about a garment, think about the fibre composition. Where's it come from? Do you know what it looks like as a plant? Those sorts of things can be actually really, really interesting. And a couple of my projects since 2010 have really looked at that kind of material story, from a seed to a fabric. They've done it through the use of colour. They've done it through looking at that story of colour through the dyeing industry in the place that the project is based. So looking at that story of a heritage and bringing it right through to today, thinking about, well, this red dye on my clothes today, what has produced that? Connecting up the dots and understanding the kind of longer story, and I think that can be really powerful.
Mm-hmm. And just getting back to the stitching that you do, how does that make you feel? Like, what's your motivation for doing that in a physical sense?
Yeah, I do find I like the focus. I find it a very kind of focused activity. Your eye is drawn to the very small area of the cloth that you're working on. I like that, and I like the fact that this is not a fixed thing. I don't have a kind of end date in mind for it. So it's a generative process. So it reminds me that no feeling is final, and there's a kind of there's always going to be something different, you know, if you can kind of keep going. So I think, you know, when I look at the back of it, you know, and I think, God, look at that absolute mess, you know, it's a real tangled mess, and I absolutely cherish the mess. I kind of encourage people who learn with me and work with me to think about messy, kind of the messiness of life and the kind of constant kind of change that we do have to deal with as human beings, as a kind of, you know, this is a positive thing. It's positive that we can engage like this. It's immense privilege for me to even carve 10 minutes out of my day to stitch me in a kind of meaningless fashion. I'm not making something, I'm not cutting out 50 coats a day and having to stitch them together. This is absolute privilege. So being able to kind of sift through my working life and my personal life in this way, yeah, it really is. It's a privilege.
It looks peaceful too. Do you feel peaceful when you are applying that needle?
Sometimes. Sometimes it's like, you know, kind of stabbing something. Depends on the day.